I'm the business development manager for Kuehne Nagel Expo and Events. I've been with the company for about 7 years, and it means I have the genuine pleasure, in most cases, of assisting contractors, UK exhibitors, and other stakeholders attending shows globally. Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. My name is Michael. I'm with Kuehne Nagel since 2006, and I'm responsible for sustainability solutions for all transport modes, and I'm very happy to be on the call today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. So we wanted to use this session to provide suggestions on how we can look at reducing our carbon footprint within the transport and logistics component of the overarching event project plan. So first of all, Michael, what role do logistics organisations like Kuehne Nagel playing in aiding the reductions of carbon emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Well, actually, when we look at the overall perspective, we are talking about roughly 35 billion tons of CO2. That's the global carbon footprint. And out of this, the transport industry is accountable for more than 3 billion tons. So this is actually quite a large portion and quite something to work on, I would say.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting statistic, isn't it? Almost 10%. So what can event professionals that are viewing this call right now, what can they do to reduce their carbon emissions right now?
Yeah, I usually say that it's like with many other things, all about the planning and doing the planning way ahead of time before the event actually takes place is, of course, the best thing to do in order to evaluate the scenario to see what are the possible options which I'm able to choose in order to transport my goods to the event location in the most eco-friendly way.
Yeah, it's definitely the obvious place to start, isn't it, planning? But being in the events industry, unfortunately, we don't get the luxury of planning very often. So what sort of examples do we have in terms of how planning can affect us?
Yeah, maybe just to pick on one example, for instance, if somebody would have to transport the goods, let's say from the US East Coast, New York, into the UK, there would, for instance, be the option, instead of air freighting this, to ship it over by ocean, which would take, let's say, 10 to 12 days, I would say. There are some quite fast connections available in the market. And by doing so, there is already a substantial potential of saving the emissions. Where we are looking at here right now is a comparison, actually, per ton of cargo per traveled kilometer. And if we just take the two extreme examples on the right-hand side, air transportation accountable for 665 grams versus 8 grams per travel kilometer per ton by sea, that means that air freighting is more than 80 times as harmful to the environment as if this would be shipped. So that's already quite a substantial gap, I would say.
So New York's quite a good example, Michael, and quite close in a lot of ways. What about Shanghai, for example, that's a little bit further afield?
Yeah, Shanghai is admittedly much more distant to the UK. We are talking more than 20,000 kilometers of distance. And of course, also the respective transit time is much longer. I think it's on average something like 35 days. So that might be too long to reach the event location in time. So an alternative could be here to find a compromise in a way of choosing a sea-air solution, which means like air freighting the goods half the way, let's say from China to a Middle East location, like Dubai, for instance, and then for the second leg to ship it by sea from the Middle East to the UK, which would mean that it doesn't take as long as these 35 days. And also, quite importantly, the CO2 reduction is immense, because half of the way it's not going to be the harmful air freighting there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something to consider, certainly on the way back from an event where time is a little bit less critical. In terms of road freight, at the moment, there's not currently too much we can do in reducing carbon emissions from, let's say, A to B. Until electric vehicles, electric trucks have become roadworthy, or alternative fuel solutions become more readily available. But what we can potentially look to do is something that we should be doing anyway, is choosing the shortest rather than the fastest route, which is something that most logistics carriers will be able to advise you on. But we can also look at how the vehicle's loaded. Is there wasted space on that trailer? Can pallets be stacked higher, or crates be double stacked to utilize that space on the trailer? It might even mean that you send 3 trailers to a show in France or whatever, rather than 4, which, you know, is a huge saving in terms of emissions, but also a huge saving in terms of cost. It's also worth mentioning and having a look at how vehicles are loaded and what equipment is being used. I've seen before 3 forklifts used to load 1 trailer, diesel forklifts, and you know, it's not an economical solution. So what we could potentially do is look to hire or purchase electric forklifts or hybrid forklifts on market to use at our facilities as well. It's all these small wins that contribute to the overriding reduction in carbon emissions. So we talked, Michael, about planning and how important that might be. What else can we do to change perceptions?
Yeah, basically, I would say it's all about, you know, looking into this a bit deeper, not just scratching the surface. We had touched this example of the sea transportation from the US East Coast to the UK, for instance, where there is already substantial potential savings versus air freight. Yet, however, within the sea freight portfolio, there is also a great variety when it comes to the different carbon footprints among the services. So we have found out, for instance, that on major routes like from the USA to the UK, by choosing the most eco-friendly sea service, because also the vessels have different size, different engine types, etc., there's another savings potential of sometimes more than 30%. So it's really worthwhile looking into this to really achieve the most out of it, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's about asking our exhibitors and suppliers, and more importantly, logistics carriers, what more can be done for us to reduce our carbon footprint on this particular movement, and not taking the options we're given at face value. Guarantee there's always something more that can be done. So we've talked about what we can do to reduce emissions, but how do we as event professionals actually measure them?
Yeah, Alex, I think the measuring part is also a very important one, because at the end of the day, we all need to know where do we stand actually. And the good news here is that there are various platforms out there where people have free access, also via websites, for instance, to start their calculation across all transport modes: air freight, sea freight, rail transportation, truck transportation. Because I think it's very important to see where do I stand with my carbon footprint, especially when the target is to achieve 100% carbon neutrality. So that is done basically in this way before further measures are being taken. Another one of the first steps to see I make myself transparent in a way and visible about my own carbon footprint.
Yeah, I think we've got to start somewhere, right? So being visible is the first place that we need to start with in actually measuring our emissions. We know that there are always going to be some unavoidable emissions. That's just the nature of the beast. But how can they be neutralized to reach a net zero status?
Yeah, basically jumping on to what we have just discussed about measuring the emissions, taking into consideration maybe all the optimizations we are able to do. There is naturally, unfortunately, still a certain portion left over for as long as we are dependent on fossil fuels. And the bad news is that, especially for the long distance transportation, be it air freight or sea freight, We will not get rid of these fossil fuels for the next 10 to 12 years, probably, until this will be replaced by other alternatives like hydrogen, for instance, yeah, just to pick one example. So for as long as this situation continues, there is the need to make use of the offsetting, actually, to reach carbon neutrality. So there are various nature-based projects available on very high standards, like gold standard, for instance, where the money can be invested in order to compensate the leftover of the emissions. And the good news here also is that this is less expensive, actually, than many people might think it is.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier, weren't we, Michael? And it was something like $20 to offset a container back from Shanghai, which is nothing, you know, in the comparison of the job itself. So it's something we can be doing right now to offset those emissions. So we've talked quite heavily on what we can do to reduce emissions, and we wanted to give you a few pointers to take away with today. So just to recap, planning is vitally important. Have those conversations with your exhibitors, suppliers, and other contractors, so everybody is on the same page and singing from the same hymn sheet to start off with. Challenge the status quo. Ask people, don't be afraid to ask what more can be done to reduce our emissions on this particular journey. Measure, become transparent, become visible. We've all got to start somewhere, so it's important that we start to look at reducing our emissions from the start. And offsetting, something we can do right now to offset any activity we've gained on carbon emissions. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for Isla for letting us host.